Thank you very much for this question, Francis. Let me sum up a summary of points here. National qualification framework should list all major sectors and specializations, informal and formal, available to learners and applicable to the needs and configuration of a dynamic national economy. The scope of frameworks should not be comprehensive of all learning achievement and pathways, but should be adequately structured and accurately aligned to a particular sector and specialization for ease of implementation and alignment. The domains and the level descriptors should incorporate the needs and emerging skills of the labor market while observing rules for minimal mapping redundancy. And we have something called the learning domains wheel, which we use Venn diagrams so that overlapping of domains doesn't happen, like numeric skills and problem solving. So most of the problem solving in engineering has to do with numeric skills. So it creates a lot of redundancy with assessment and evaluation. The other thing is a set of criteria should not be implicit, but rather explicit in a hierarchical structure showing vertical progression in learning, built up with a set of level descriptors for each domain and the levels of learning. Now, each level of qualification should be further structured to levels of learning, enabling ease of implementation, and so that we have learning progression clearly for institutions and programs and for accreditation agencies to implement these. The domains, levels, and details of level descriptors should be categorized for each listed sector and specialization, which we don't have today. And there should be an accurate distinction definition of what outcomes are, skills are, and competencies. So these are some essential aspects with which we can basically try to solve the skills gap happening and have better qualification frameworks that can be implemented. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wajid, for that. But just a follow up on that. With your experience, because the question is about a national qualification framework. So, can you share with us your experience, let's say, in your country, on your experience and the response on transformational?
Actually, we haven't done any kind of national qualification frameworks in the US, but I'm working in Saudi for many schools. So the issues that we faced are basically a shift in what the domains were. So previously we had numeric skills, we have cognitive skills, then we have knowledge, and then we had psychomotor skills. And so we shifted out to knowledge, competencies, and skills. And even now there has to be a clearer definition of this. And I had a presentation yesterday. There's a whole bunch of detail, but the countries are basically grappling with what the domain should be, and these domains should not incorporate redundancy and should not just look at the market, but rather look at it from an assessment standpoint for institutions to implement this. So that goes in line with what I said in the first place.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wajid. So I'll move on to our next panelist, Dr. Lovelia. Okay, how can we recalibrate content-based curriculum? It's in our country, in the Philippines, we're fond of this content-based curriculum frame. So how can we recalibrate this content-based curriculum framework into a more transformational OBE?
Thank you so much for that question, Dr. Francis Uy. In fact, this is one challenge, specifically even in our country, in the Philippines, but quite as well as similar to other countries wherein we so much invest more on content kind of curriculum, content-based kind of curriculum that we try to implement teaching learning. We try to implement qualifications based on the number of units, the number of contents that we are actually offering to our students. So in other words, we can change only our perspective of getting into authentic OBE when really know by heart what is outcome-based education, and how is authentic OBE, or the usual normal OBE that we call it, into how is it different from transformational OBE. Well, the very essence of transformational OBE believes in the role of education in elevating human consciousness and values, understanding multiple intelligence, honing unique human potentials. Generations of learners will serve as agents of building and shaping a livable future for humanity. But we need to define what is a livable future for us. How do we envision people will live? What kind of environment do we want to thrive? Who dominates in such an environment, human or technological? So these are many philosophical questions that we need to entertain as well, so that we can reposition ourselves on where we are right now, using content-based curriculum into coming more transformational. So in other words, what is at the heart is the learner. So where are we going to place our learner? In what position? Learners should be the means themselves, but not the end, because they are there to be the agents of what we want to have in the future. So in other words, content-based right now is like, we cannot do away with that right away, especially in us in the Philippines, or in any other countries who are still in the context of a content-based. We actually, what makes it content-based, because we oftentimes only extract learning outcomes from the content, from the topic, but not really looking at it in the essence that what are the outcomes of significance that we are expecting for our learners to achieve in a certain period. So in other words, make content-based curriculum as our primary resources, tools. Okay. Reshift the implementation into like repackaging them in such a way that they are addressing what is authentic, what is real, what is the reality that we want to happen to our learners, and what kind of reality we are preparing them in the future, or are they also part of that creation of the reality. So making now content as our tool, as our instrument to be used in order for us to achieve what we want to achieve in empowering our learners. So I think that's a basic principle that we can think of how we can make use of that content-based curriculum framework into something that is more outcome-based.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Velia. Do you agree, Dr. Sampa? And what do you think would be the essential elements then for a curriculum design? Which I think this is one of your the focus of your work, Dr. Sampa.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the presence of other members of the panel. I think what we need to do is to really look at what kind of graduates we want. That is, we really have to start with that kind of question. If we are thinking about educating an engineer, the end product is really an engineer, right? So when we ask ourselves, what make an engineer, a doctor, you know, a driver, a driver, naturally that will lead us to talk about outcomes. Okay. The problem with the content is that for some time, many educational systems, particularly people who are assigned to evaluate and monitor and implement national educational systems, they have tended to start by looking at topics. So there's what we call content standards. Then they talk about performance standards. Then they talk about all these time standards, including the time. Like you are required to meet a certain number of hours, right? In the Philippines, for any 3-unit course, you need 54 hours, right? So we have a lot of all these input type things, which are really not so bad, but they are designed to ensure that some degree of quality can come out of the process. Mm. But because we have overdone them, we end up with the form without substance. If we only shift our thinking by really looking at how do you really come up with a competent teacher, a competent driver, a competent engineer, you can agree with almost everybody working in the environment to say they need to have this and that and that. You can establish that. We will always need content. I think Rovera is right, Dr. Rovera. We will need content for sure because there is a knowledge dimension, but knowledge dimension alone doesn't mean anything. You can know a lot, but doesn't mean that it can guarantee your actions, right? So, but when we begin to look at the outcomes, we guarantee action, we guarantee knowledge, we guarantee everything else that require a person to function competently. So my thinking is the Philippines in particular is best positioned to really do a lot of change and transformation because the Philippines doesn't have external examinations. This is something that many countries are struggling with, particularly in the K-12 system. Because if you're in Australia or the United States, you always have to think about external examinations that will be given to your grade 12 students or grade 10 for them to be considered competent. In the Philippines, we don't have that problem, meaning to say schools are adequately empowered to do a lot by themselves. If you go to higher education as well, what the Commission on Higher Education has given are what we call the curriculum standards. So they give you what we call minimum standards. They don't tell you maximum, right? So these are minimum things that you really need to ensure that you are meeting. As a result, there's so much of autonomy that we all enjoy institutionally. And I think, given that autonomy is given very much to schools, we can decide to simply say, let's remove objectives from our design. Let's talk about outcomes rather than objectives, because objectives define what teachers have to do. Let's remove that, replace it with outcomes. And from the outcomes, you can now have other columns that have to do with other minimum requirements and processes that are required to deliver education for anybody within that discipline. And I think in the Philippines, we are very close to that because as your experience will tell, the Commission on Higher Education doesn't come to take a look at your textbooks. You decide on the textbooks. Like it doesn't tell you how many pages have you covered before you give a bachelor's degree. They don't do that. So decisions about who is competent, who is qualified are done by schools. Universities do that. The deans do that. Individual professors do that. And they submit that information to. So we have a lot of capacity in the Philippine context to really achieve more outcome-based rather than content-driven type of education. So I see a lot of hope there. A lot can be done.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sampa, for that response. And now, since it appears it requires what we call change in culture. So I would like to ask now Attorney Largo. And actually, I learned a lot of things about USC, and I think that's also a reason why I'm now in my first year in law.
I hope you're seeing opening in your law school.
Yeah, first year and it's enough. Just kidding. Anyway, Attorney Largo, ma'am, what steps did you take to manage this culture change in your university? Because you're very famous about this in really pioneering outcomes-based education in another profession, which is, of course, mostly we just hear about engineering, and now it's in law. So how did you manage culture change in your university to really, for you to be able, for your community to adopt outcomes-based education?
Thank you for that question, because really I agree, and it really is true that in the law school, especially in the Philippines, the people, the culture, the structure of law schools are really not conducive to coherence. The natural tendency is for individualism. So it's not, in fact, very uncommon for people not to have collective and coherent view of the program. What we would usually do is, just teach and not even ask ourselves what kind of graduates we want to have. So so OBE really is sort of the farthest thing from our minds until there has been a paradigm shift that had been adopted. So in other words, in order for OBE to really come to fruition and to really be a reality, it requires a buy-in on the part of the government, but not only that, also of the top leaders in the university. In the Philippine context, for example, we have the Legal Education Board. We also have WorkShed mandating for us and adopting the concept of OBE. And what that essentially means in the context of law schools that had been used to working individually and on specialization is that now there has been a set declared competencies and outcomes that law schools can work on. But it really started with that, a declaration of outcomes, like what Professor had said. We must have a common understanding of what kind of graduates we want to have. So it started with a paradigm shift, and then from there it trickled to changes in the policies and the pedagogy, as well as even also in the processes. Thank you, Francis.
Okay, thank you, attorney. Okay, now let's move on to Dr. Alfredo. Still on outcomes. With your experience, because you're an expert on aligning learning outcomes, also looking at assessment methods, quality assessment, and so. But first, how do you design teaching or learning activities based on the defined outcomes that, let's say, your organization or your institution define or has come up with?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's a very difficult question, $1 million one. You know, how do you do that? That's there are no straight rules or guidelines. The point is that you have to use your own pedagogical experience. One of the things I've been external expert in the Spanish accreditation agency, ANECA, for 6 years. So I have looked into the proof that all the engineering programs that wanted the EURACE label had the learning outcomes correctly implemented for the graduates. And how did we do that? And just to answer your question, how do we do that? We verify the evidences provided by the programs, by the schools, that these learning outcomes were achieved. And reversing the problem, I think the teachers, if you want to have learning outcomes, the teacher has to guarantee, to ensure that there are evidences that these outcomes are achieved by the graduates, and that's a big question, not easy to do, but that's basically the challenge for the teachers who want to implement certain learning outcomes, is try to find concrete evidences that the students at the end of the program will acquire the competencies as we want them to have. And like I said, it's $1 million answer, not question, but answer, to provide that. My experience tells me that you have to try and to try. I'm still trying. I've many years of teaching. I'm still changing every year, trying the approach, because you're never sure that they acquire. And there will always be some that will never acquire. There's another thing that, from my experience, it's really important on this topic, is that don't try to ensure that all the graduates will have 100% of that competence. They'll probably have 50%, 40%, something like that. But don't try to make them be fully competent on that learning outcome.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Alfredo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it's important that we are open to this, and that's the reason why we have this in for OB, for us to learn from each other and for us to find new ways of doing things. Now, now looking at the impact of adopting this paradigm outcomes-based education, and we talk about its impact to national development. May I ask Professor Amin, Professor Amin, how can we link outcomes-based engineering education with the, say, let's say, the national development trajectories, or even policy and priorities?
Okay, thank you very much. Basically, here I will emphasize on outcomes-based engineering education. So it's some kind of engine. So you need some engines to fly an airplane. So same thing is for the economic development and economic prosperity. So you need infrastructure, and you need some housing, and you need some telecommunication. These are all coming as outcomes from engineers' work. So to make all those things basically successful, we used to depend most on the input-based system. So it was not the outcomes-based system. So outcome-based system is now getting directly audited, and with our national development plan. So particularly the developing countries require it more because the future investments should be societally acceptable, and also it's economically viable, and also it gives a sustainable development for the future. So you may know the SDG goals. In SDG goals, the quality education is the number 4. So the quality education is also related to major safe cities, good aquatic environment, and good human resource development, and so. So in this area, basically we have at least 6 to 7 items in the SDG where we need to focus on outcomes delivered by the engineers. So in that way, basically most of the developing country, like the developed world, is now embracing the outcome-based education, and its great transformation process is taking place over the last few years and over a decade. And also Bangladesh, my country, is in the same journey. And we, following the Washington Accord attributes, we have defined the attributes of the engineers, and that is based on the outcome-based education. And there we relate outcomes directly to the solving of complex engineering problems and complex engineering activities. That is the highest level of outcome that an engineer has to display at his graduation through in his cohort, so that we can ensure that this engineer will be able to display the best outcome in his profession, and the program educational objectives can be attained in the engineering programs. So in that way, the outcome from the engineering discipline is directly linked with our national development policies.
Okay, thank you, Professor Amin. And you mentioned about Washington Accord. Now, we've been subjecting ourselves to what we call ABET accreditation. So let me ask now Professor John, because I think it's one of the I've maybe even became an evaluator and been with ABET for with this work. So Professor John, how does accreditation or ABET promotes outcomes-based education?
Okay, first, thank you for the invitation to this panel. Appreciate it. And thank you for the question. Now, it should be noted that for many years, ABET did not promote OBE. Back in the day, it was being counted. When I was a student, and actually when I started out as a professor, ABET dictated all major elements of an accredited engineering program. It told you what the program curriculum had to be. They talked about the faculty, they talked about facilities. But in the 1990s, there was a bit of an uproar about this. Was this a valid way of going about things? So this was a bottom-up process for ABET going towards an OBE format. So a lot of people might have heard over the years something called EC 2000 or Engineering Criteria 2000. This changed the focus from what is taught to what is learned. And that's where things started to change for the better, I think, for engineering education. And we've had this for roughly about 25 years now in the US. Although ABET has 4 commissions, we're going to focus on just the Engineering Accreditation Commission so that I don't have to talk about the nuances between the 4 commissions. But originally, the EAC specified 11 student learning outcomes, collectively representing the expectations of what an engineering student is expected to be capable of by the time of graduation. So regardless of what field of engineering, these were the commonalities true to all engineers. So while the learning outcomes emphasize the development of students' mathematical, scientific, technical knowledge, it also emphasizes developing other professional skills, such as solving unstructured problems, communicating effectively with a wide variety of audiences, and working in teams, to give a few examples. The criteria also stresses awareness of ethical and professional responsibilities, consideration of public health, safety, welfare, understanding the impact of engineering solutions in a variety of contexts, such as environmental, societal, global. So in a sense, the student learning outcomes that ABET have developed in order to promote outcomes-based education provides, shall we say, a lower bound of commonality across all accredited programs, regardless of the discipline-specific nature of that engineering program. So you're specifying along the general criteria what those minimum standards are, and then program criteria will up the standards for that specific discipline. And then programs themselves can set up in either higher level in various areas that would best meet the needs of their constituency groups. So it's kind of a layered process. So there's more than just ABET. It's kind of ABET enables people to really embrace outcomes-based education.
Okay, thank you, Professor John. Now, let's move on to technology and innovation. And let me again go back to Dr. Wajid Hussain, because as you know, because of the pandemic, I think a lot of us all of us were pushed really into, of course, adoption of some kind of technology or innovation for us to continue learning even during the pandemic. Dr. Wajid, how important is the use of technology or adoption of innovation in implementing of OBE, outcomes-based education, given the COVID pandemic or the new normal, let's say new normal and beyond?
Thank you very much, Francis. I don't know if the screen is working because am I coming on the main screen? Okay, all right, fantastic. So actually, the COVID-19, I shouldn't say that, but it had its positives and negatives. So the positive I want to whisper it is it actually accelerated the encouragement for schools and institutions aggressively into adopting technology, looking into technology. Everybody in academic conferences starts talking about digital technology, hybrid learning, and all of these aspects. We have technology, digital technology in tourism, in hospitality, in medicine, in law, but unfortunately, in education, it's not properly implemented. If you look at any student and you look at learner-centered models, you're talking about hundreds of skills in an undergraduate program, maybe 400, 500 skills. Now, how do you document that manually? And then when you look at multiple course modules and you look into term by term, so what accreditation agencies do, they start pushing for randomization and sampling. When you go for randomization and sampling, you basically kill OBE. It moves away from student-centered models to the program and institutional-centered models. So it's more towards institutional KPIs, not student performance indicators. So the key thing about the right kind of digital technology is it has to have a mechanism to record information for all students, because Spatty's formula is all students have to be successful. But how can you make them successful when you don't even have the outcomes information? So sad to say, NACADA, National Academy of Advising, University of Kansas, talks about advising to be on outcomes, based on outcome, but we hardly found one program in the world in our exhaustive studies where the advising really happens on quantitative direct assessment data. So we've actually done it in our programs, but we use John Estell's faculty course assessment report, which has the performance vector. We incorporated that into eval tools, and we start grabbing information for every student. So even if you have 1 million students, we'll catch it. If you have 500 skills, information for every student, we'll catch it. We'll catch it term-wise, course-wise, and we will use it for advising. We could see all red color, and then we can see a streak of green, which means that this particular student is very good in communication or very good in critical thinking, and we'll advise the student to move towards his God-given inherent survival qualities, which God has given to that student. So we'll push him towards a successful career path. So with digital technology, the right kind of technology, embedded assessments like and then FCAR, performance vectors, and integrating LMS, OS, CIMS, AS. I don't want to make it complex, sound like a rap, but you see, we have done all of that. 1 million documents on the cloud. So we need to move towards real technology. So the real technology is still not out there. We have another panel talking about this. I don't want to talk too much. Let's move on.
Okay, thank you, Wajid. Dr. Lovella, just to be specific and based on your experience, in what way teachers can be given support? I mean, on technology, with our experience, what means or ways do you think it has been effective and really helpful for teachers to continue implementing outcomes-based education? What technologies do you think that you adopted or your institution?
Yeah. In fact, talking about technology, if we're going to talk about it in the context in the country, well, of course, different universities using different technology platform, learning management platforms. In fact, coming from an OBE perspective, technology is very helpful in terms of, like, for example, in our case, we are using Moodle platform. So what we usually we do when using that platform is to communicate to our students what are the essential learnings that have to be achieved for a certain period of time. Well, I was so amazed when I was listening to Wajid, hopefully that we can have that kind of system that even in assessment, because I think that's one challenge as well, no, in assessment, of how we can assess further our students using this technology. But much more that the LMS is doing is that really on, at least, no, for the kind of context that we are having in the country, challenges that teachers are having in terms of the utilization, aside from having the platform, it's still a challenge, but OBE can still be implemented by choosing only what's the best learning for a moment that we can give our students in terms of exercising skills, utilizing knowledge, and come up with some processes. We are bringing our students more into becoming an information literate. This is one opportunity that we've learned that is an emerging learning outcome practically, just like what Dr. Alfredo had mentioned, that it's very difficult to set a standard as to what learning outcomes we have to provide, but it's always for a teachable moment or for a callable moment, what is essential, what is vital, and that what calls for the creativity of teachers to make use of that particular technological learning management system. So, well, different learning management system has different approaches in engaging students to materials, to learning materials. But most importantly, teachers should be empowered, because this is the #1 challenge right now, if our teachers really are that savvy in the use of the technology. So that's one thing that we need to empower them. And second, maybe the orientation of what is really outcome-based education. And it has to come from the institution itself, the frameworking, the vision, the mission, the philosophy of the institution, and how they are going to look at education in terms of outcome-based education. So that's what matters. The rest will follow when we truly understand the essence of OBE.
Okay.
But it's more of a challenges.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lovella. Now, Dr. Sampa, what should teachers or professors focus on the use of technology, and still they become faithful on authentic outcomes-based education? Because, as you know, this is now the new normal, and and beyond. During the pandemic, there has been a lot of technology adoption, and it's something that we need to think about. Is it something that we need to continue doing or adopting? And like, let's say, class meetings, there are learning management system, and there are also issues that comes with it. Experiments, for example, there were introduction of virtual labs, okay, or simulations, and some even did modified home experiments because of the protocols or lockdowns, and even some resulted to use of integrating videos, especially from YouTube, let's say, just to be able to have a substitute on field works and also on practicum, their online mentorings, and so. And another important thing is about assessment. So what do you think would the educators or professors should focus on, even with all this technology around? You're on mute, Dr. Sampa. Please unmute.
Sorry for that. Yeah, you see, that has been my concern, but I am quite fortunate to experience stuff because my exposure to transnational education. I don't think that technology should take over the function of teaching. Okay, that's a myth. It's not going to work. So I am not thinking about how much of technology we need. Outcome-based education is about capacitating people to become competent. So if we are looking at technology integration, we are talking about modalities of communicating with our students, because students learn by doing. Teachers provide feedback to student learning. That's communication, purely communication. So there will be opportunities where students can video themselves and do everything they need. Okay, we don't have to be worried about whether students will do it or not. There are a lot of existing technologies that enable you to capture student process of learning. Actually, Coursera, for example, has produced a lot of modalities that can be used. You can essentially document your own learning throughout. And I've seen some of them in my training with Australian system, where we train people in technological areas. They can purely document their entire learning. They can also learn from the videos, and then they are going to fulfill certain functions, and then document that by video and send it. Then the auditors will audit that for authenticity, which is very much what we are doing in accreditation. Students can document their own evidence of learning, and then when you evaluate the evidence of learning, you can assess them. So it's really not so complicated. It's just that people are too much into teachers controlling the learning process. I think what outcome-based education can provide us here is let learning be led by the students. We are facilitators. And insofar as we can create clear outcomes and train students to go through following through those outcomes and build their capacities, then our job will be simply to validate what students build up and then use that as information we need to actually confirm their learning or maybe require them additional more learning in order for them to become competent. So I have really no issue with technology. I know that in a private capacity, everybody's using technology today. What you can do with a mobile phone is a lot. You don't need more complicated technology in teaching. And social media also is providing a lot of free platforms, which can enable people to train themselves in anything they want, including crazy stuff, like bomb making and other stuff that we don't want people to learn. But the platforms can provide all that. So what we need, I think, is to try to be conscious of all available technologies and fit them into the outcomes. Which outcome can be achieved by what type of technology? And how can students access that? If the technology is too costly, don't go into it. But those that are more accessible to students, we can still find ways and patterns to make sure that they can facilitate student realization of outcomes. Thank you. Dr. Francis, you are muted yourself.
Yeah, sorry.
No,
Yeah, do you agree, Professor Amin? And would you like to add more about it based on your experience?
No, it's okay. And basically now world is becoming a global village. And we already talked about ABET. And basically we were the members of the Washington Accord signatories or provisional signatories under the International Engineering Alliance. And basically International Engineering Alliance is now getting connected to World Federation of Engineering Organizations, WIFO, and it's connected to SDG. And in that way, basically we are connected to graduate attributes and professional competency together. So from 2024, all the signatories of Washington Accord will be moving towards new graduate attributes that are tagged with the professional competency. So basically the learning starts from the attaining the graduate attributes, and it continues up to achieving the professional competency after the graduation. So it's a complete chain of work towards a sustainable and better world together. So in that way, basically, we are having a great metamorphosis, not only in the engineering education, but also in the professional competency areas. So it's connected with the lifelong learning. This is also an important attribute. So there might be some gap even in the graduate level attribute attainment, but it can be made over successfully if the lifelong learning, communication skills, and others continue towards attaining the not only the program outcomes, but also the program educational objectives. So in that way, accreditation agencies will work in the coming years and the decade towards giving a more valuable engineers in developing national and international assets. So that is the greatest outcome of today.
Okay, thank you, Professor Amin. And also the Philippines hope to soon become a full member of the
Yes.
Washington Accord.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, moving on, technology. How about on assessment? Dr. Alfredo, can learning be really properly assessed by available technology, especially on grading? What do you think about that? Because assessment has been a challenge, really, if especially during the pandemic. But of course, it's not limited on that, even beyond. But you can also give us maybe your experience or your knowledge on how it was done during the pandemic and how we can move forward in beyond.
Well, good. Thank you for the question. I mean, it is a very important issue, especially during the pandemic and in the future, my belief is that there will be more distance courses and e-learning. So probably a lot of assessment is being done virtually. My idea about this issue is that it can be done. Yesterday, you can watch the session. I presented a model to evaluate precisely different types of learning outcomes in a virtual environment. You can check it. It's the time to assess learning outcomes in e-learning. It was derived from a PhD thesis I supervised with the University of Texas, Austin. It is in fact a tool that proposes methods according to the alignment of Anderson et al. Between the different types of learning outcomes and the right assessment techniques. It gives suggestions. Again, it's not black and white. Education is never black and white, except for the student who gets a grade. For him, it's black and white. But for everything else, it's not. And this model that chooses the right assessment methods for the different type of learning outcomes in a virtual environment is something that it's a rational procedure. My experience is that when assessing, it's a very emotional and personal decision from the teacher to find the assessment methods. And we need a rational approach for choosing the right assessment techniques, because the student will suffer. If we don't take into account his learning style, whatever competencies he has and the way he can express his competencies, he or she are going to suffer. And that's terrible. I think it's a big injustice. That's one thing. The other thing is that we need to prepare teachers to work online, number one, and to assess online. And during the pandemic, my impression is that there was not enough training. Everybody was rushed and tried to replicate what they were doing in a face-to-face classroom, in a learning management system or whatever approach the school had. And it was a disaster from my point of view, because for online teaching and assessing, you had to deconstruct our own way of thinking in pedagogical and teaching and assessing terms, and reconstruct. There are things that have not been exploited, like simulation, augmented reality, and virtual reality, and we need to work more on that. There's needed more research, more training specifically. I started in the continuing education area and lifelong learning many years ago, more than 30 years ago. And I know that teachers need more help, more support, and more training. That's my
Thank you. Thank you, indeed, Dr. Alfredo. And Professor Jan, still on assessment. Then how can, say, performance vectors be used in the assessment and evaluation and still support outcomes-based education based on your experience?
Okay, thanks for the question. Let's quickly define what a performance vector is. It's a way to categorize aggregate student performance, shall we say, on a particular assignment. And there's multiple ways you can do it, but the one that's best known is the EAMU vector, for excellent, adequate, minimal, unsatisfactory. You're trying to provide a common format, because if you don't expect a common format, you are going to get from your faculty a whole bunch of different formats, and you're trying to figure out how to get any sense out of that data. So having faculty adopt a common format for reporting their assessment data, I think, is critical to actually get to the point of being able to make that decision. Hey, where are we with all this? So the aggregate Reporting also allows you to see how your students are collectively doing at each of those levels. You can use heuristics to then set red, yellow, or green flags. So if you see a lot in the unsatisfactory, it's probably not them. It's probably you did not do a good enough job with your assignment or the way you presented the information. So it's not entirely on the students. It's just as much on us. And this is a way that we can realize we failed to connect, we failed them in providing information. One of the things I love about performance vectors is that you get away from the let's talk about how well we did with our grades mindset. We want our students to be successful. The grading on a bell curve, which is where the lower grades came from, is really the worst thing we can do to our students. So we want to talk about expectations. That adequate in the performance vectors is a way to say, this is where we expect you to be with this particular assessment. Now, if you do better than that, students can exceed our expectations. Great, fabulous. And sometimes we have students that don't fully measure up to expectations, and we can figure out what are the little things that we need to do to help that student master the material. And then there are students that sadly are either not capable or don't even attempt, which would be the unsatisfactory level. But we can look at this as a spectrum and say, at the time of graduation, this is where we expect you to be. And maybe in that first year course, they're all performing at unsatisfactory or minimal levels. Nothing wrong with that if we are looking at a continuum and saying, this is where we can see they are at when they're coming in for this cohort. Here is our curriculum that is designed to get them from that low level to this high level by the fourth year. So it gives us a clarity of focus as well from that standpoint, that we can say, this is the expectation. We know that you are not starting out with that stuff, because if you did, why bother going to school? You already have mastered material. So we have to assume that people coming in are at unsatisfactory minimal levels for the stuff that we're saying by the time of graduation. And we're focusing our efforts to go from that point A of the inputs to that point B of when they graduate.
Okay. Thank you, Professor John. And to summarize the discussion on OBE and technology, I would like to ask now Attorney Largo. Attorney,
Yes.
what enabling policies do you think should be put in place to enable to support our faculty and embrace outcomes-based education, and also adopt the appropriate technology? Because I understand, even like, though it's not about, maybe not necessarily about OB, but the bar now, yeah, it's still taken online with that, and I know you have much to do with that. So yeah, can you tell us or discuss that with us? Thank you.
Yeah, I was really reflecting on that, Dr. Francis, and it really starts, I think, with us providing clear answers to our faculty on the very simple, a very complex question, rather, of what kind of graduates we want to see. When we provide them with clear answers as to the kind of graduates we want to see, then everything can just flow from there. For example, when we said that we do not just want graduates who are ready to take the bar examinations. What we want is practice ready, in fact, life ready graduates. We broke free from a curriculum, from an approach that is very much fixated with content curriculum and content-based curriculum, and that allowed our faculty to experiment on the kind of assessments that they can give. It starts, I think, with a very clear answer to the question of what kind of graduates we want to see.
Okay, thank you, Attorney, for that answer. And for the last round, I will now request to each of our panel members to give a final message on or maybe advice to our participants here, our viewers, in relation to how they can better move principles of outcomes-based education from to real practice. And I will start now with okay, let's start with Professor Amin.
Okay, thank you.
Your final
Yes.
message to our participants.
Yes.
Sir?
Basically, outcomes-based education is a general terminology now in the education system. But of course, there are systems in law, in medicine, in engineering, and also the general sciences. So I believe every discipline should be carefully revisiting the necessity or the visionary thinking about their graduates and how they want to see their graduates in their practical field. We need the physicists to work as a great physicist. We need the engineers to work as a great engineer. We need to work our lawyers and correctly in their field. So in that way, the assessment, the definition of the graduate attributes is the key for the outcomes-based education. So graduate attributes and professional competencies should be a universal term to be defined in every discipline of the education. This is not only for the engineering, but also for the every education approaches. So outcomes-based education is giving that messages to every of us.
Thank you, Professor Amin. And Professor John?
I would say, try to make it very short and sweet. It's best to adopt practices for assessment that are sufficient for making informed decisions, sustainable so that it's not a burden upon your faculty or your staff, and streamlined so that they are easily understood. Full stop, period.
Very well said, Professor John. Short, simple, but sweet. Okay, Dr. Lovelia?
I was reflecting. Well, I heard that we've been focusing more on professionals, but we have to always remember that when we speak of education, it has to encompass everyone in the community, that we have to consider them this community to be a learning community. So in other words, learning empowerment has to be extended. Understanding that is to be expanded into not only for our professionals, but how do we prepare them when they are at earliest developmental stages. So to empower learners, maybe we can begin by always believing the same as that of OBE belief, that learners do not learn in the same way and on the same day. By this mere belief alone can already catalyzed or can be a catalyst for us to think of what can be done. What are these things that adults like us, responsible for envisioning the kind of future we want to have for our younger generations of generations to have in the future, and how we should define the kind of learning outcome, the kind of who they are, what we want them to become, to address, to be responsive to that kind of future. So I believe that this will highly influence our decisions in organizing our educational system that is responsive to the purpose of our institutional philosophy. If we are in a higher education institution, maybe the vision, mission, and goals of even for basic educations for our learners, and that can be what can be our contribution as a learning institution that would affect the demands of the 21st century to our local community before even going beyond global education or global learning communities. This will even change our perspective on how we look at education once we really truly understand the very nature of the learner that we have. We still have to go back to the principle that above all else, what we want to do, there must always be the preservation of humanness in us. So I think this is just one important thing that we always to be reminded of ourselves as adults, as responsible individuals who are taking charge right now of the coming future. So we need to think about what is that we want them to learn as outcomes of significance that are addressing family, school, society's expectations of them at a certain point in time of life stages, for what purpose or value that we want them to learn those functional outcomes. So I think this is just one of the fundamental idea or principles that that outcome-based education would like to give us as a message for everyone in whatever direction we want to pursue. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Lavella. It's true. We have to come together and agree on that matter. And Dr. Sampa?
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, one of the insights that I've gotten from our team right now, which I think affirms some of the struggles of my teachers and professors that I work with to train them in capacity building, in assessment and stuff like this, is that once we define what outcomes we are looking at, once we think about what kind of graduates we want, the first step, we need to convert that into an assessment. Because if that's what we want, how do you measure it? What are the evidences? Then use that to create what we call a criterion, which is actually the one that I've worked with to create is a 5-point criterion. Every student needs to take an S, satisfactory. And from the satisfactory, then you can graduate them from being excellent, outstanding, whatever it is. But they have to be competent because there's no professional space that requires competent people. So the first step, really, a grade of entry point has to be a successful Victorian system government in Australia. They use S and N. They do not have fail and pass. A student has to be satisfactory or not yet satisfactory. If not yet, you have to be retaught until you are satisfactory. Then after passing that stage, then they are going to grade you on 10 points. You know, very good, outstanding, whatever it is. I think that's a very good way of thinking about outcomes. Every outcome we need to define. How are we going to define a person as being competent on this outcome? The first step is the entry point, a passing grade. A passing grade is a 3 out of 5. Okay, that's the entry point. Then we can take a look at other considerations in terms of what makes someone to be considered outstanding. In that sense, we are not forcing to bring every student to the same level, no, but we are going to inspire greatness of spirit, but at the same time determining where being competent stands. You know, where do you start to be considered really a competent person in this aspect? So that moves us away from the tradition of marks, scores, and how many items we get right. We just have to be very simple. So what I've given many of people I train is really a 5-point scale. Actually, it's 3 scale. Good, very good, excellent. And then you have descriptors. The descriptors are coming from the description of outcomes. So if we're assessing an engineer, assessing a lawyer, in this particular subject, what exactly should they be? Define them. So that becomes our 0.5, then 0.4, then 0.3. Outside of that, we call it not yet competent. That means they need more expanded opportunity, they need more support to ensure that, but before they can be considered passing, we have to make sure that they at least strike a 3, minimum expectation of being competent.
Yeah, it's true. Don't accept low performance.
Exactly, yes. So it has to be like that. So we make it very simple. Avoid all checking of papers and too many things, stuff, too much of technology that is designed to aggregate, remove aggregation. Just go straight forward. What does it mean to be competent? Are these indicators acceptable to other professionals in the field? If it's accepted, that's it. So it's either you have it or you don't have it. And then we can actually proliferate modalities of showing that demonstration. And that makes life easier for teachers. And again, you are right. I think, Dr. Francis, universities need to empower faculty members to make these decisions. That Correct. You can't enter into the brain of a person to determine where they are, but that assessment has to be dealing with production of evidence. And evidence can't be the same for every student. They should allow faculty members to design what is acceptable as evidence for every band of qualification. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sampa. And now let's move on to Dr. Alfredo.
Well, I'll be like John. I'll try to be simple. I don't know about the sweetness, but I'll try to be simple. I think that all of us are here discussing issues that we understand and we are interested in. And for one point, I congratulate for OBE because the organization, because this allows us to share case studies, research, opinions, etc. And I think we should do more of that. I think that each one of us should do more efforts to know what the others are doing, to explain what we are doing, and exchange good cases and also bad cases. I mean, you also learn from bad cases. So
yeah.
That's my recommendation.
Yes, true, Dr. Wajid. At least we know that it's not effective or it doesn't work, right? Yeah. Okay. And of course, I think we lost Dr. Wajid, but anyway, let's move on to Attorney Largo. Attorney?
Yeah, so very quickly, what I just want to say is to move OBE from principles to practice or to action. Franz, we really just have to believe in the promise and the potential of OBE. From what I have seen personally, OBE makes for purposive teaching, coherent curriculum, collaborative teaching, enhanced learning activities, meaningful assessment, and more importantly for me, it is a measure of accountability to the public, to the students, to the teacher. I really, really love OBE.
Okay, thank you, Attorney. And I think that's all the time we have for this panel discussion on models of learning, moving from principles to practices. Thank you very much to all our panelists for the time, and thank you very much for our participants for joining us here. So since we are all over the world, so I will just say good morning, good afternoon, and good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.